Sarah Mitchell stood at her kitchen window, watching the morning sun cast long shadows across her well-tended garden. The aroma of fresh coffee mingled with the jasmine blooming outside, but she barely noticed either. Her mind was fixed on a courthouse where she would soon testify. At 52, she had spent decades building a respectable life in Montgomery, raising 3 children, and running a successful home cleaning service that catered to some of the city's most prominent families. The clock on her wall ticked steadily as she smoothed down her best Sunday dress, navy blue with tiny white dots, pressed to perfection the night before. Her daughter Mary had urged her to wear something less noticeable, something that wouldn't draw attention. But Sarah had made her choice. If she was going to speak her truth today, she would do so looking her finest. The previous week played through her mind like a film reel. She had been tending to Mrs. Washington's garden, as she often did on Tuesday afternoons, when she witnessed the incident. Mr. Thompson, the owner of the adjacent property, had deliberately damaged the fence that separated the 2 yards. It wasn't the first time he had caused trouble for the elderly Mrs. Washington, but it would be the first time someone stood up to testify about it. Sarah gathered her handbag and the small notebook where she had meticulously recorded what she had seen that day. Her handwriting was precise, each detail captured with the same care she brought to everything she did. Her late husband James had always said she had a memory like a photograph, and today that gift would serve a greater purpose. The walk to the courthouse was exactly 15 blocks. Sarah had walked it twice already that week, timing herself, ensuring she would arrive early. As she passed through her neighborhood, familiar faces nodded in greeting. Some knew where she was headed. Others simply recognized the determined set of her shoulders, the careful way she carried herself. Outside Anderson's grocery, young Tommy Jefferson was sweeping the sidewalk. He paused his work to tip his hat to her, just as his mother had taught him. "Morning, Miss Sarah," he called out, his voice carrying the respect she had earned through years of being a pillar in their community. She remembered teaching him his letters when he was just 5, sitting on her porch with a slate and chalk after his mother's long shifts at the hospital. The courthouse loomed ahead, its classical columns rising like ancient sentinels against the Alabama sky. Sarah paused at the bottom of the steps, her hand finding the small gold cross she always wore, a graduation gift from her mother, who had cleaned houses before her. 3 generations of Mitchell women had built their lives in this city, had watched it change and stayed unchanged in their dedication to what was right. As she climbed the steps, Sarah felt the weight of those generations with her. The morning heat was building, but she didn't quicken her pace. Each step was measured, deliberate. Inside her handbag, her notebook seemed to pulse with the truth it contained. She had not sought out this moment, but now that it had found her, she would meet it with the grace and strength that had carried her through all of life's challenges. The heavy courthouse doors opened before her, releasing a blast of cool air. Sarah Mitchell stepped inside, ready to take her place in history, not as a symbol or a hero, but as a woman who simply chose to speak the truth as she saw it, regardless of the price that truth might carry. The courtroom's polished wooden benches gleamed under fluorescent lights as Sarah took her seat in the witness waiting area. Around her, the morning's cases proceeded with mechanical efficiency. Traffic violations, property disputes, and minor civil matters. She sat straight-backed, her notebook resting in her lap, watching as Mrs. Washington's lawyer, Mr. Benjamin Foster, organized his papers at the defense table. Mrs. Washington herself sat in the front row, her silver hair crowned with a small hat adorned with artificial violets. Despite her 82 years, she maintained the dignified bearing of a former schoolteacher. Their eyes met briefly, and Mrs. Washington gave a small, encouraging nod. Their friendship had begun 3 years ago, when Sarah started tending to the elderly woman's garden, sharing cups of lemonade and stories of their grandchildren. "Mitchell versus Thompson," the court clerk announced, his voice echoing through the chamber. Sarah noticed how Mr. Thompson strode to the plaintiff's table, his expensive suit and confident manner suggesting he expected a swift victory. He had brought his own witnesses, 2 men from his country club who claimed they had seen Mrs. Washington's tree roots damaging his property, not his deliberate destruction of the fence. When Sarah's name was called to testify, she rose smoothly, years of careful movement serving her well. The Bible felt cool beneath her palm as she took the oath, her voice clear and steady. "I do so swear," she stated, meeting the clerk's eyes directly. Judge Harrison shifted in his seat, his gaze sharp beneath heavy brows. Mr. Foster approached first, his questions gentle but precise. "Mrs. Mitchell, could you please tell the court what you witnessed on the afternoon of July 15th? He gestured encouragingly, and Sarah opened her testimony like unwrapping a precious gift. "I was tending to Mrs. Washington's roses," she began, her voice carrying to every corner of the hushed courtroom. "The sun was still high, about 3 in the afternoon. I keep careful track of time because I have appointments with other clients." She paused, retrieving her notebook. "I heard the sound of wood splintering first." Sarah described the scene with perfect clarity. How she had looked up to see Mr. Thompson and his groundskeeper attacking the fence with crowbars, how they had systematically worked their way down the property line, how she had documented each action with the precision that came from years of keeping detailed household accounts. Mr. Thompson's lawyer objected twice during her testimony, claiming her observations were circumstantial. Judge Harrison overruled him both times, but his face grew increasingly stern as Sarah continued to address the court with unwavering composure, refusing to be rattled by interruptions. When asked about Mr. Thompson's previous actions, Sarah spoke of other incidents she had witnessed: the mysterious herbicide that had killed Mrs. Washington's prized hydrangeas, the suddenly redirected drainage that flooded her vegetable garden. She presented each fact like a properly folded sheet, smooth and without wrinkles of doubt. The air in the courtroom grew heavy with tension as Sarah maintained her dignified demeanor. She could feel Mr. Thompson's growing discomfort, see Judge Harrison's increasing agitation at her collected presence. But Sarah continued, her voice steady, her truth unfolding like a map that would guide them all to justice, regardless of the personal costs she might have to bear. The morning light streaming through the high windows seemed to gather around her as she spoke, illuminating not just her testimony, but the power of one person's commitment to truth in the face of expected submission. The courtroom air grew thick with expectation as Mr. Thompson's lawyer rose for cross-examination. A tall man with silver-streaked hair and wire-rimmed glasses, Mr. James Preston had a reputation for dismantling witness testimonies with surgical precision. He approached the witness stand with measured steps, adjusting his tie as he prepared to begin. "Mrs. Mitchell," he started, his voice honey smooth, "you've worked as a housekeeper for many prominent families in Montgomery, haven't you?" The question hung in the air like Spanish moss, seemingly harmless but carrying hidden weight. Sarah recognized the strategy, an attempt to establish her as someone who should know her place. "I own a residential cleaning service," Sarah corrected him gently, her voice clear as church bells on Sunday morning. "I employ 5 people and manage accounts for 12 properties." She maintained eye contact, her posture perfect, her hands folded quietly in her lap. Mr. Preston's smile tightened slightly. He paced before the witness stand, his expensive shoes clicking against the hardwood floor. "And in your business," he continued, emphasizing the word with subtle doubt, "you claim to have time to observe the activities of others while working." Sarah reached for her notebook, her movements unhurried. "I keep detailed records of all my observations during working hours. It helps me maintain professional standards." She opened to a precise page, the dates and times recorded in her careful handwriting. On July 15th, at 3:17 p.m., while tending to Mrs. Washington's rose garden, I heard the first crack of wood. Judge Harrison leaned forward, his interest piqued by her methodical approach. Sarah could see a mixture of surprise and something else, perhaps respect, flicker across his features. She continued before Mr. Preston could interrupt, her voice steady, as she recounted the events with clockwork precision. The sound drew my attention to the fence line. Mr. Thompson and his groundskeeper, Mr. Davis, were using crowbars to separate the wooden panels. I noted the time, location, and their actions. She turned the page of her notebook. At 3:24 p.m., they had removed 3 panels. By 3:45 p.m., the entire section of fencing was damaged beyond repair. Mr. Preston's attempts to shake her testimony met with the same calm precision. Each question aimed at undermining her credibility was answered with quiet facts, times, dates, and observations recorded in her notebook. The lawyer's frustration began to show in the tightening of his shoulders, the slight flush creeping up his neck. "And you expect this court to believe," he finally demanded, his composure slipping, "that you can remember such specific details about events that didn't directly concern you?" Sarah smiled softly, remembering her father's words from long ago. "Truth doesn't need memory. It lives in your bones." She looked directly at Mr. Preston, her voice gentle but firm. "Sir, I've spent my life paying attention to details others might miss. It's how I built my business, how I raised my children, and how I serve my community. When something isn't right, I notice. And when something isn't right, I remember." The gallery behind her rustled with murmurs of approval. Judge Harrison rapped his gavel once, restoring order, but Sarah could see in his eyes that her words had landed. Mr. Preston paused, papers shuffling in his hands, searching for another angle of attack. But Sarah sat serene in her truth, like a rock in a rushing stream, unmoved by the forces trying to wear her down. The afternoon sun slanted through the courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the courtroom floor as the testimony entered its 3rd hour. Sarah's voice remained steady, though she had declined the court officer's offer of water twice. Her grandmother had taught her that sometimes staying strong meant refusing small comforts that could be mistaken for weakness. Mr. Foster approached the bench with a collection of photographs. "Your Honor, I'd like to present evidence that corroborates Mrs. Mitchell's testimony." The images taken by Mrs. Washington's nephew the day after the incident showed the systematic destruction of the fence. Sarah noticed how Judge Harrison studied each photograph with increasing attention, his earlier skepticism giving way to focused interest. "Mrs. Mitchell," Mr. Foster continued, "could you tell us about your relationship with Mrs. Washington and why you chose to come forward with this testimony?" The question opened a door to the heart of the matter, and Sarah felt the weight of every eye in the courtroom. "I've known Mrs. Washington for 3 years, Sarah began, her voice warm with genuine affection. "She taught 3 generations of children in this community before retiring. When her husband passed, I started helping with her garden. She pays me with stories and wisdom." Sarah paused, choosing her words carefully. "But this isn't about friendship. This is about doing what's right." From his seat, Mr. Thompson shifted uncomfortably, whispering urgently to his lawyer. The photographs had changed something in the room's atmosphere. Sarah's detailed timeline, matched against the physical evidence, had created a narrative that couldn't easily be dismissed. Judge Harrison removed his glasses, polishing them thoughtfully. "Mrs. Mitchell, your attention to detail is remarkable." His tone carried a note of surprise that might have been offensive in another context, but Sarah received it with grace. "Have you maintained similar records of other incidents involving the defendant's property?" "Yes, Your Honor," Sarah replied, turning to a marked page in her notebook. "On March 15th, I documented the sudden appearance of chemical burn patterns on Mrs. Washington's hydrangeas, which aligned perfectly with the property line. On April 22nd, I recorded the installation of new drainage pipes on Mr. Thompson's property that redirected water flow into Mrs. Washington's vegetable garden." The judge's eyebrows rose slightly. Mr. Thompson's face had grown pale, and his lawyer's attempts to object were met with firm overruling. Sarah continued presenting her observations, each one backed by dates, times, and detailed descriptions that painted a clear picture of systematic harassment. Mrs. Washington sat in the gallery, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, watching as months of frustration and helplessness were transformed into powerful testimony through Sarah's careful documentation. Young Tommy Jefferson, who had slipped into the courtroom during his lunch break from Anderson's grocery, sat wide-eyed in the back row, witnessing a lesson in dignity and determination more valuable than any textbook could provide. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah felt a subtle shift in the courtroom's energy. The initial skepticism that had greeted her testimony had given way to something else, a grudging respect from some, and from others, particularly the younger people in the gallery, something that looked like hope. Mr. Foster concluded his questioning with a simple statement, "No further questions, Your Honor." But Sarah knew the day's true test was still to come. As she prepared to step down from the witness stand, she caught Mrs. Washington's eye again. The elderly teacher gave her another small nod, this one filled with pride and gratitude that made every careful word worth the risk of speaking it. The late afternoon shadows had begun to lengthen across the courtroom when Mr. Thompson's lawyer arose for his final round of questioning. The air conditioning hummed softly, barely masking the tension that had settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Sarah remained composed, though she had been on the witness stand for nearly 4 hours. "Mrs. Mitchell," Mr. Preston began, his voice carrying a new edge of desperation, "let's discuss your motivations." He pulled out a document from his briefcase with theatrical flourish. "Are you aware that Mrs. Washington's property value has increased by 30% since the renovations on Mr. Thompson's estate began?" Sarah's expression remained serene as she answered, "I'm aware that good neighbors increase property values, Mr. Preston, just as I'm aware that harassment decreases them." A slight murmur rippled through the courtroom, quickly silenced by Judge Harrison's stern glance. Mr. Thompson, who had been writing furious notes to his lawyer, suddenly stood up. "Your Honor, this is ridiculous. Are we really going to let this housekeeper dictate how I manage my property?" His face had turned an alarming shade of red, his carefully maintained composure cracking. Judge Harrison's gavel came down sharply. "Mr. Thompson, you will take your seat or face contempt charges." The judge's voice carried the weight of authority, but Sarah noticed something else in his tone, a hint of recognition that something extraordinary was unfolding in his courtroom. Sarah straightened in her chair, her voice clear and steady as morning light. "Mr. Preston, you asked about my motivations. They're quite simple. I believe in being a good neighbor. I believe in standing up for what's right. And I believe that everyone, regardless of their position in life, has a responsibility to speak the truth when they see wrong being done." The young court reporter's fingers flew across her stenotype machine, capturing every word. Sarah could see several members of the gallery leaning forward, drawn in by the quiet power of her testimony. Even the bailiff, who had maintained professional detachment throughout the proceedings, was watching intently. Mr. Preston tried one last approach. "Mrs. Mitchell, isn't it true that you stand to benefit from testifying? That Mrs. Washington has promised to remember you in her will?" His insinuation hung in the air like smoke. Sarah's response came with the clarity of mountain spring water. "Mr. Preston, my reward is being able to look in the mirror each morning and know I've done what's right. Mrs. Washington taught children to read for 40 years. She deserves to tend her garden in peace. That's the only benefit I'm interested in." Judge Harrison removed his glasses, studying Sarah with an intensity that might have made a lesser person nervous. But Sarah met his gaze steadily, her truth unwavering. The moment stretched between them like a bridge being built, connecting two different understandings of justice. "Redirect, Your Honor." Mr. Foster stood, but Judge Harrison shook his head. "I believe Mrs. Mitchell has made herself perfectly clear," the judge said, his words carrying a weight that silenced the courtroom. "Sometimes," he continued, looking directly at Mr. Thompson, "the simplest truths are the most powerful." As Sarah finally stepped down from the witness stand, she felt lighter, as if speaking her truth had lifted a burden she hadn't known she was carrying. Mrs. Washington wiped a tear from her cheek, and young Tommy Jefferson, still watching from the back row, sat up straighter in his seat, witnessing a lesson in courage that would stay with him for years to come. The verdict came as the sun was setting, painting the courthouse windows in shades of amber and gold. Judge Harrison's decision was clear and unequivocal. Mr. Thompson would be required to replace the fence at his own expense, pay damages for the destroyed gardens, and install proper drainage that would not affect Mrs. Washington's property. As the courtroom began to empty, Sarah gathered her notebook and purse with the same careful precision she had shown throughout the day. She noticed Mr. Thompson storming out through the side door, his lawyer hurrying behind him with a briefcase full of unused arguments. But it was the reactions of others that caught her attention. The young court reporter, a woman named Rebecca, approached her with shining eyes. "Mrs. Mitchell," she said softly, "I've been recording testimonies for 3 years, but I've never—" She paused, searching for the right words. "The way you spoke today, it was like poetry. Every word perfect and true." Sarah smiled warmly, remembering her own daughter's first attempts at finding her voice. "Truth doesn't need fancy decorations, child. It just needs someone willing to speak it." She patted Rebecca's hand gently before making her way toward Mrs. Washington. The elderly teacher was surrounded by a small group of well-wishers, including her nephew with his camera, and 3 former students who had come to show support. When she saw Sarah approaching, Mrs. Washington broke away from the group, embracing her with the strength that belied her fragile appearance. "You did it, Sarah," Mrs. Washington whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You really did it." Sarah returned the embrace, aware of the history they were making. Not the kind that makes headlines, but the quiet kind that changes hearts and minds one courtroom at a time. "We did it together," she replied. "Your courage in bringing the case gave me the strength to speak." As they walked out of the courthouse together, they found a small crowd had gathered on the steps. Word had spread through the neighborhood about Sarah's testimony. Mary, Sarah's daughter, stood at the bottom of the steps with Sarah's grandchildren, her face glowing with pride. Tommy Jefferson had brought his mother, who still wore her nurse's uniform from her hospital shift. Judge Harrison, emerging from his chambers, paused at the top of the steps. He watched as Sarah was greeted by her community, saw the respect in their eyes, the way they made space for her to pass. Something in his expression suggested he was seeing more than just the aftermath of a property dispute case. The evening air was sweet with jasmine, reminding Sarah of her garden at home. As people began to disperse, Mrs. Washington's nephew approached with his camera. "May I take a picture?" he asked. "For the family album." Sarah stood with Mrs. Washington on the courthouse steps, both of them straight-backed and smiling, their dignity as natural as breathing. The camera captured not just 2 women, but a moment when truth spoken quietly proved stronger than power wielded carelessly. Later that evening, as Sarah watered her own garden in the gathering dusk, she reflected on the day's events. Her flowers stretched toward the last rays of sunlight, just as she had reached for truth in that courtroom. From her porch, she could see Mrs. Washington's house, where the damaged fence would soon be replaced with something stronger, something built on a foundation of justice and respect. A week after the trial, Sarah's garden bloomed with extraordinary vigor, as if nature itself celebrated her victory. The morning sun cast dappled shadows through her prized rose bushes as she prepared for her first catering event. A garden party Mrs. Washington had insisted on hosting to thank those who supported her during the trial. The invitations, written in Mrs. Washington's elegant teacher's handwriting, had drawn an unexpected mix of guests. Rebecca, the court reporter, arrived early, offering to help arrange chairs. She brought her mother, who owned a small bakery downtown, and together they set up a display of delicate pastries on Sarah's best tablecloth. The whole town's talking about what happened in that courtroom, Rebecca's mother confided as she arranged sugar roses on a 3-tiered cake. "My customers can't stop discussing how you spoke with such grace under pressure." Sarah simply smiled, knowing that sometimes the quietest actions echo the loudest. Tommy Jefferson arrived with a surprise. He'd convinced Mr. Anderson to donate refreshments from the grocery store. The boy had also started a notebook of his own, inspired by Sarah's detailed record-keeping. "I'm writing down everything important that happens in the neighborhood," he explained proudly, showing her his careful observations of daily life. The party grew as afternoon approached. Teachers from Mrs. Washington's old school arrived, bringing former students who now had children of their own. Sarah's cleaning service employees came, wearing their Sunday best, each carrying a dish to share. They'd moved through the garden with professional grace, helping to serve and ensure everyone's comfort. The highlight came when Judge Harrison himself made an appearance. He arrived without ceremony, carrying a potted peace lily. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said, his judicial formality softened by genuine respect, "I wanted to thank you. Your testimony has made me reconsider how we conduct proceedings in my courtroom." He paused, choosing his words carefully. Sometimes it takes seeing something from a new perspective to understand what justice truly means. Sarah's daughter Mary watched this exchange with tears in her eyes, remembering all the times her mother had taught her about dignity through actions rather than words. Her own daughters, dressed in their finest, helped pass out lemonade to the guests, their backs straight, their smiles genuine, already learning the lesson of graceful strength. Mrs. Washington, seated in a place of honor beneath Sarah's largest magnolia tree, beamed as she watched the gathering. The new fence was already under construction, but more importantly, new connections were being built between neighbors who had never spoken before. As the afternoon progressed, Sarah noticed subtle changes in how people interacted. The carefully maintained social barriers that had long divided the community began to soften. Conversations flowed more freely, laughter became more genuine, and stories were shared across previously unbridgeable gaps. Near sunset, Mrs. Washington stood to make a toast. Her voice, strong from decades of commanding classrooms, carried across the garden. "Today we celebrate not just a legal victory, but a reminder that true justice grows from the seeds of everyday courage." Sarah showed us that speaking truth with dignity can change more than just a single outcome. It can change hearts. The gathered crowd raised their glasses of lemonade as the setting sun painted the sky in shades of hope. Sarah's garden had become more than just a beautiful space. It was now a symbol of what could grow when truth was tended with care and courage was nurtured with dignity. 1 year later, Sarah's garden had become a gathering place for the community. The roses she planted along the path now bloomed in vibrant clusters, their fragrance welcoming visitors who regularly sought her wisdom and company. The notebook that had held her crucial testimony rested in a place of honor on her bookshelf, inspiring others to keep their own records of truth. On a bright Sunday afternoon, Sarah sat on her porch with her youngest granddaughter, Emma, who was practicing her cursive writing. "Grandma," Emma asked, looking up from her notebook, "Miss Rebecca at the courthouse said you changed things. What exactly did you change?" Sarah smiled, watching butterflies dance among her zinnias. The garden party had indeed sparked changes that continued to ripple through their community. The local newspaper had hired Rebecca as their first female court reporter, and she now covered all major trials with the same attention to detail she'd admired in Sarah's testimony. "Sometimes, sweetheart," Sarah explained, "change is like planting a garden. You start with a single seed of truth, tend it with dignity, and watch it grow." She pointed to Mrs. Washington's yard next door, where the new fence stood as a testament to justice, covered now in morning glories that bloomed on both sides. Tommy Jefferson, now in high school, had started a community newsletter, inspired by his detailed observations of neighborhood life. He'd even won a journalism scholarship, citing Sarah's influence in his application essay. His mother had been promoted to head nurse at the hospital, her quiet competence finally recognized and rewarded. Judge Harrison had indeed transformed his courtroom procedures, ensuring that every witness, regardless of their station in life, was treated with equal respect. He occasionally stopped by Sarah's garden to discuss cases where truth and justice intersected in unexpected ways. Mrs. Washington's garden thrived under the shared care of neighbors who had discovered the joy of community through that first garden party. Weekly gatherings now brought together people from all walks of life, sharing stories and breaking bread under the shade of her old magnolia tree. Sarah's cleaning service had evolved into a successful small business management consulting firm, with her daughter Mary as her partner. They taught other women how to build their own enterprises, emphasizing the importance of meticulous record-keeping and unwavering integrity. "You see, Emma," Sarah continued, watching her granddaughter carefully copy down her words. Real change happens when people realize that dignity isn't something that's given to you. It's something you carry inside, like a light. And when you share that light, it grows stronger. The afternoon sun painted shadows through the crepe myrtle trees Sarah had planted to commemorate the trial's anniversary. Each leaf seemed to whisper the story of that day, not as a tale of defiance, but as a testament to the power of speaking truth with grace. As Emma finished writing, Sarah saw her own mother's strength in her granddaughter's determined expression. 3 generations of wisdom flowed through the careful strokes of Emma's pen, just as 3 generations of courage had flowing through Sarah's testimony that day in court. The biggest change, Sarah concluded, watching the sun set over her flourishing garden, is that people now understand that every voice matters, every truth counts, and every act of dignity helps build a better world. She hugged Emma close, knowing that her legacy would live on not in grand gestures or famous speeches, but in the quiet courage of those who chose to speak their truth with grace and stand firm in their dignity.